Well, Durga, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And it's always great to have a company like Qualcomm join us on stage because you have such a global perspective. You see things from such a different perspective from so many of our other speakers. And that's really where I'd like us to begin. If you could maybe, thinking globally, thinking about what's happening internationally, where are we on our 5G journey?
All right, awesome. So lots of things to talk about over here. So first of all, if you kind of think about it, we are almost about 5 years into the launch of 5G in the US. We started in 2019. It's kind of amazing to think about it that way. So one view is, if you think of a typical 10-year G cycle, we're halfway there. But there's a little bit more to it. We started off with a bang in 2019 across US, Korea, Europe, Japan, Australia, and China. But these days, when you take a look at the other regions at scale, we see deployments starting off in India. They started last year, in LATAM, in Middle East, in Southeast Asia. And one of the interesting aspects about the 5G launches in the last maybe year and a half or so is they had the luxury of having a clear and a clean slate standalone mode of 5G deployment. So it's kind of an interesting take that those who launched in 2019 would probably launch with non-standalone mode, but now with standalone mode. So that means we are kind of really primed in terms of all the capabilities and the features that we used to talk about so extensively back in 2019 and continue to do so in a lot of parts of the world. A lot of the speakers before me actually talked about what we've done in the US so far.
Great. Well, when we were talking before, you mentioned that we're at a phase where we're looking at something called 5G Advanced. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what that means. So, what is 5G Advanced? What does it mean for devices in the network? And how does it relate to other technologies that we're talking about now, like AI, O-RAN, cloud computing?
So if you remember, it's, back in the day when we talked about 5G and I think everyone has that famous triangle in place of mobile broadband and ultra low latency and reliable communications and massive IoT. So it's kind of important to take a perspective of exactly where are we today and what that means in the context of 5G Advanced. So a lot has happened in the overall domain of mobile broadband expansion. So the two things that are kind of important in that domain with 5G Advanced are increasingly flexible mix and match of different carriers and increasing the number of carriers that you can aggregate together. In the US, we have gone all the way up to 4 and 5 carriers that can be mixed and matched together, FTD and TDD, and we are gradually going beyond that into 5 and 6 carriers that are aggregated together. And that means more broadband speeds, the average data rates go up, and importantly, it gives the operators a lot of flexibility in terms of how they can deploy the network, which means the aggregated bandwidth has already reached close to about 300 megahertz or so. It's quite amazing. The other part, and I believe that this is something that we always used to talk of, but we never really paid that much attention to uplink data rates. We always talk of downlink data rates, 4, 5x carrier aggregation. But if there is one thing that has changed, whether it's because of the pandemic or whether it's because of 5G, if you remember, how do you make a phone call and you would say, well, I take a phone and talk like this. You talk to your kids and they would say, we talk like this. In other words, video telephony has become very important and it's kind of taken for granted now, which means uplink data rates are equally important. So aggregating more and more bandwidth in the uplink, very key. It's an important aspect of 5G Advanced. The third one is proliferation of 5G into mass tier devices. And we'll talk a little bit more about it, but in general, the idea of forget about the 5 and 10 gigabit per second data rate capabilities, but let's actually talk in terms of just 100 megabits per second. There's so much more you can do in the consumer and industrial IoT space, and that's one of the vertices of the triangle of massive IoT. So that's like a third aspect of 5G Advanced. A fourth one is a gradual incorporation of satellite communications as an integral part of 5G in itself. Not something that's treated separately, but baked into the standards process. We are beginning to see at least emergency services and so on, basic services that are offered, but we have to bring all of that into the 5G umbrella so it becomes very easy for operators to offer services based upon that. And the last one, we cannot afford to ignore the role of AI as it gradually permeates every single industry, and in wireless communications it's no different. So AI is going to be an integral part of 5G Advanced as we move forward, as we take steps towards the next thing. AI is used today in devices for lots of things, but it's also used in multiple other segments, whether it becomes network autonomy or the ability to improve the performance beyond what is typically prescribed in the standards process. So this is an overall 5G advanced technology standpoint. Two other data points are the networks are gradually evolving, and what started off as classical telco networks, as they have been evolving over time, increasingly embracing AI technology into the network and becoming more cloud native. What that means is a second wave of virtualization of the network, where we are beginning to bring in new capabilities. So I would put all of this under the broad umbrella of 5G advanced.
Now, that's interesting. Now, you alluded earlier to what this means for devices. Now, here in Washington, we're always about 5 years behind the times, maybe more. A wireless device is, for us, still a smartphone, but that's not really true anymore, is it? 5G, what does 5G and 5G Advanced mean for what we should think of as a wireless device, and what does it mean for smartphones?
As a part of the proliferation of 5G into all kinds of devices, let's keep smartphones aside for now, and let's talk about three segments over here. Segment number 1 is fixed wireless access. I would call it as a runaway hit for 5G. Nobody talked too much about it, but it's probably been a shining example of what we said we could do with 5G, and today fixed wireless access devices are practically in every single region that we can think of. So that's taken a life of its own. But then we have two other aspects. It's consumer IoT and industrial IoT. So when we talk of industrial IoT, there's still work to be done in that space, lots of POCs and trials. But this is about bringing the capabilities of 5G into devices, which could be anything ranging from smart meters, water meters, and gas meters towards industrial equipment and high precision equipment. And to that effect, there is a specific thing that was introduced in standards. It's called RedCap. It's a misnomer, reduced capability. But actually, the way to think about it is it's 100 megabits per second to 100 to 200 megabits per second capable devices. But with those devices, we can use 5G into all these metering services, including eventually into wearables as well. So fixed wireless access, I would put a check saying, yes, we've done a pretty good job. Lots more work to be done in industrial and consumer IoT, but that's what we talk of when we think of devices beyond smartphones and even laptops. In the computing segment, we always had communication capability in it beyond Wi-Fi. But let's keep both of those to aside, but these are the places where we need to invest a lot more. Fixed wireless access, on the other hand, we've done a pretty good job.
Now, quick follow-up on that, if I may. You talked about we're seeing fixed wireless across all regions. We've talked here today a little bit about what it means for the U.S. Do you have a perspective on what kind of impact it's having internationally?
From an international standpoint, what we've seen is that there's some statistics that I've seen in certain regions where almost 80 to 85% of the country actually doesn't have any kind of mobile broadband. And we're not talking of gigabit data rates. We're not even talking of 500 megabits per second. We're talking of less than 10 megabits per second at best. So the act of having just 100 megabits per second is actually more than sufficient just to have the basic connectivity. Because if there is one thing that pretty much the entire world takes for granted these days is connectivity. There's a lot of things that you can bring to the table, but it's really the fabric of society in some sense. And so every region, every policymaker in most parts of the world have paid attention to how do we get to a very large cross-section of the population towards full connectivity, and definition of mobile broadband as 100 megabits per second as a bottle point.
That's really interesting. Now, to take us back to the U.S. here, but still with that international mindset, we've talked a lot here today about spectrum generally, about the need for more spectrum, the need for mid-band spectrum specifically. From your perspective, as you think about what you're seeing internationally, and indeed some of what you just said about 5G fixed wireless, what should U.S. policymakers be thinking about when it comes to spectrum policy for 5G? What kind of bands we should be looking at? What should we be doing?
I think we did a pretty good job as we started off 5G, but at this point in time, as we are looking at, we now have the ability to aggregate up to 200 to 300 megahertz of spectrum. What are the new bands which are kind of important? Spectrum at the end of the day happens to be with it's the life of what we actually do. That's what you need to offer more services. So it's kind of important to get it right as we head towards 5G Advanced and 6G. Good clean spectrum would be a very simplistic way of establishing that baseline. It should be something that shouldn't be too complicated, but make it simple enough so that we can get started. There's already several bands in play across the world, and what we have seen, the most recently concluded WRC in 2023, But right here in the US for us, well, in 5G, we started off with mid-bands. We came in with 2 waves of the mid-bands on 2.6 and then eventually in the 3.8 gigahertz band and with millimeter wave. But as we kind of look ahead, the 7 gigahertz band is something that we should definitely pay attention to, but making sure that it's good clean spectrum, as in what is the best way to actually utilize it. There's always 6 gigahertz. That's a topic that's been in discussion for a while now. It's already used by some in the Wi-Fi community today. But keeping that aside, I think it's important to focus on spectrum that is indeed usable and very fast to deploy as we move forwards with that, so that we don't have a lot of issues associated with how much do we need to work around things. I think that's an important part as we move forwards.
That's great. Durga, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us.
Thank you.